I'll give you a little bit of background before we go into it.
Yeah, go ahead. Let's see.
So this lesson reveals two views of the resurrection. You got the world's view of it, and then you got a Christian view of it. Paul was under house arrest in Caesarea, and he's waiting to be transferred to Rome at this time. You have Festus, who's the governor. He had heard Paul's defense before his accusers, which was the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. And he asked whether Paul would be willing to go to Jerusalem to stand trial for these charges.
Listen to this.
Paul had been from Jerusalem, or not from Jerusalem, but Rome, been a Jew. He knew what he had faced there before. So Paul knows if I'm taken back to Jerusalem, I'm either going to be murdered on the way or condemned during a mock trial. So like we see Paul's done in times past in the book of Acts, he claims his Roman citizenship. And it's kind of like us living here in this country. We have civil rights.
Right.
If I arrest Richard and go too far on it, it's me that gets arrested because he has civil rights. But that meant that Festus had to send along the charges that warranted taking his case to Caesar. Because if he exercised his rights as a Roman citizen, that would appeal to Caesar. So as Festus pondered that, his friends Agrippa and his sister Bernice arrived to visit him. And since Agrippa was an expert in Jewish matters, Festus told him about the case to get his opinion. Verses 18 and 19 is kind of Festus' summary of this case to Agrippa. It was essentially shop talk between two different rulers. But it views the world's view on it, and you have the Christian view on it, which is represented by Paul. The world, Richard mentioned something about being indifferent earlier, or neutral. You can't remain neutral on this.
No.
It's either one way or the other. And if you choose not to choose today, you refused it. You refuse the gospel. Yep. But the Christian view is the most important, the resurrection is the most important fact in history. And it is to the Christian believer. Starting at verse 13, and after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came into Caesarea to salute Festus. And when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king, saying, "This is a certain man," called him a certain man, "left in bonds by Felix." So Festus is face to face with a helpless prisoner who had no regard or trouble confronting the influential Sanhedrin government. Festus was a procurator and Rome's area representative. King Agrippa wasn't just anybody. He had his fair share of contacts and influence in the area too. He was well versed in Jewish matters because he practiced Jewish religion. But Festus knows he really needs help in removing himself from Caesar's displeasure of having Paul's case referred to him. It's probably not something Caesar wanted to hear. And I'm sure he had to tread lightly with Caesar, who would probably consider this matter trivial. So Festus lays on his charm before Agrippa, and he plays a gracious host. And remember one thing about Agrippa, his father is the one that killed James and arrested Peter. Verse 15, about whom when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. To whom I answered, it is not the manner of Romans to deliver any man to die. Before that, he which is accused have the accusers face to face, and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. It means Paul has a right to produce witnesses just like we do in this country. He has a right to testify on his own behalf. But these are strong religious words. Festus had already had Paul face to face with the accusers, and now he's prepared for trial. If he'd really been interested in justice, Jerusalem would have been filled with Christian people who Paul had influenced all these days. The amount of people that were saved, the gospel that was preached. None of those people were invited in this. So thousands of people could testify on Paul's behalf. But really, Festus here is the hypocrite. The world can only imagine or remember a failing church member, a church hypocrite. No one remembers the failing business hypocrite, the intellectual hypocrite,
Come on.
the professional hypocrite. It's always just the failing Christian. That's all people see. Verse 17, therefore when they were come hither, without any delay on the morrow, I sat on judgment seat, and commanded the man to be brought forth, against whom when the accusers stood up, they brought none accusation of such things as I supposed. They didn't have a whole lot of evidence.
Right.
But had certain questions against him of their own superstition, and one of Jesus, and of one Jesus, referred to him as one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. So King Agrippa could have only winced at these other religions. The Jewish faith reached back all the way to the beginning of time. It was pure, strengthening, and most importantly, inspired by God. And you think about it, it embodies the greatest truth that's ever been revealed to mankind. Still does.
Yep.
And for most of the Jewish race, they have been good stewards of the word. Nothing greater to their ancestral faith will be known until the coming of Jesus Christ and the New Testament revelation. Yet as noble as it was, Festus, like a lot of people, simply calls it superstition. I had a good friend a few years ago, he was a classmate of mine, who said just that. 2 days before he died, Jimmy Mitchell, you know him, I was talking to him about the Bible, and he says, if you want to believe that superstitious fairy tale, you go on. 2 days later, he took a run and dropped dead. He made a choice.
Yes, he did.
The truth about Christ's resurrection had now escaped the Roman magistrates. No one had ever been like Jesus at this point, and no one ever will. He was the most, whether you want to deny his godship, there's writers that can write probably the most influential man that's ever walked on the face of the earth. But Festus referred to him as one Jesus. He didn't know him, had no interest in knowing him, knew nothing about his life, knew nothing about the birth, the burial, or the resurrection, just wasn't interested. And all he knew was there was a controversy whether one Jesus was dead or alive. And what makes it so ironic, you have Festus here, you have Paul. Paul's one of the greatest influential preachers that ever stepped foot on the earth, probably the most. And he doesn't see it, because he doesn't want to see it. He was better than Greece or Rome, anything they had to offer. But if you look back to verse 14, Festus refers to Paul as just a certain man, more than a certain man. Verse 20, and because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged by these matters. And when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. Festus is trying to place himself in a more favorable position here.
Sure was.
He's pretending to be fair and the noble Roman, and that he was anxious to get to the truth. He wanted to give Paul a hearing before the court that best qualified to weigh the pros and the cons of the cases. He knew well Paul's chances were slim in front of the high priest. Paul had already been tried before and sentenced by the Jewish court. He had to bow to the claim of the royal court. Verse 22, then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear the man myself. He wants to hear Peter himself, or Paul himself. Tomorrow, said he, thou shalt hear him. Festus is now gratified. Christianity is still ablaze at this certain time in Palestine.
Right.
This story of Jesus is still strong, it's still out there, it's still blazing. And all those who Jesus has surrounded himself, they're all still alive except for James. So there's many witnesses. And by far, Paul was the best educated, most sophisticated preacher in that time. He was well-traveled, eloquent speaker. I think somebody said with his education, he would have the equivalent of 5 master's degrees. It's pretty good. Verse 23, and on the morrow when Agrippa was come, Bernice was with great pomp and was entered into the place of hearing with the chief captains, the principal men of the city, and at Festus' commandment, Paul was brought forth. So you've got a picture here, Paul's under arrest. He's likely chained to a Roman soldier. He's abandoned by his own church in Jerusalem and the apostles. He's probably weak in appearance, but he stood before the court. But with all Paul's went through, I guarantee he's unfazed at this. It doesn't bother him. Verse 24, Festus said, King Agrippa and all men which are here present with us, ye see this man about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. Paul was innocent of any charge of which the Roman court could take notice of, and it was obvious. Paul always had the Roman court in his favor because Paul was a Roman citizen. Couldn't put you to death. Nothing such as insurrection or riot could be said about Paul, couldn't be proven against Paul because it wasn't true. He'd never transgressed the Jewish law or tradition. They really had no case on him. It's over the resurrection belief. Festus knew Paul would never get a fair trial before his own people. So he has more of a serious problem now. Do we let Paul go and risk a riot, or hand him over to the Jews? But the biggest problem that Festus faces, it's a local religious problem. Because what had Paul really done to provoke these actions? Nothing. It's no different than me going out, making something up on Hub, and arresting him. Verse 25. But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I have determined to send him. So where do you go from here? Paul's not just a Jew, he's also a Roman. He had civil rights. Festus ignored him. And he's sorry now that he's completely ignored Paul's civil rights. So he has no recourse other than to send the case before Caesar. Verse 26, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord, wherefore I have brought him forth before you, especially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination I might have somewhat to write. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. He has a bigger problem now, Festus does. He has to send Paul's case before Caesar, and Paul's completely innocent, but he's wanting him judged for crimes that he still didn't commit. So Paul was good, he was eloquent. He's that good that they can't frame him. So now all Paul had to do was simply tell the truth, give his testimony, which would serve not only as a legal defense on his behalf, but he also witnessed for Jesus Christ.
Bless your heart.